lesson for October 17th is entitled, God Provides Our Future. The key verse is from Genesis 22, verse 14, which says, So Abraham called that place, The Lord Will Provide, and to this day it is said, On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The scripture is from Genesis 22, verses 1 through 18. The lesson focus: God will provide when we are fully and totally surrendered to His will. In the overview, it says the remarkableness of the remarkable Abraham has shone through in the 3 previous lessons. It reached its climax in this incident. Dates in this record are hard to establish and are merely incidental to the unfolding drama of his life. He was likely between 118 and 125 years of age at this time. He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. His full life and the fullness of his years clamor for our attention. In the introduction, it says that Genesis 22 is one of the most profound and thought-provoking chapters in the entire Old Testament. Though Abraham had demonstrated genuine faith at several crucial times in his life, God saw fit to give Abraham's faith one more significant challenge. None of us would relish being placed in the position in which God placed Abraham when He instructed him to take his beloved son and offer him as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. But Abraham's response to this supreme test is one of the reasons he has been considered one of the greatest people of faith ever to live. Abraham's exceptional life reached its peak in this remarkable passage of Scripture. It was a life-changing event for him. He became known as a friend of God. He paved the way for us today. Let us find and follow His footprints in making friendship with God the goal of our lives. In part 1, it says, Abraham knew how to listen to the voice of God. The text is from Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2, which says, Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. God decided that Abraham needed to be tested on the commitments he had made to God. The test benefited Abraham and the people around him. Hollow promises and half-hearted commitments are unacceptable to God. Had Abraham really listened to God, or was he taking his commitments for granted? Had he begun to depend on the physical presence of Isaac to bring about the fulfillment of the promises of God, rather than depending on what God had promised? True obedience requires that our actions must be as accurate as our words. At any rate, God spoke to him audibly, and Abraham understood. Today, God speaks to us through the written word. Are we getting the message? Abraham was on speaking terms with the loving God. The warmth and responsiveness of his reply is astounding. There was no loud shouting or prolonged discussion. Here I am, he replied. His ears were open. He eagerly awaited God's response. Doubtless, he was jolted, wide awake by what God said to him. It was clear, direct, and unequivocal. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. His mind was not cluttered with his own agenda. His personal plans did not drown out God's voice. It is important to listen to God. It is also essential to obey God. In part 2, it says, Abraham knew how to obey the command of God. And the text is from Genesis 22, verses 3 through 5, which says, Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." There was no quibbling, no asking for a repeat of the command. He had heard correctly. His frame of mind was that of Samuel's. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." He was ready to follow God's direction. Abraham's silence was deafening. He had until the next morning to mull over what he had heard and to plan for the trip. None of his inner thoughts are shared in the written record, but it must have been a very long night. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. Starting early was essential, so they could achieve as much progress in the journey as possible before the arrival of the excessive heat. Then, too, true obedience avoids unreasonable procrastination. God gives sufficient time to ascertain what he says to us. Credulous and gullible decisions have played havoc with some immature Christians. Haste truly makes waste in such cases. Abraham gathered together everything needed to carry out his assignment. It was a very difficult task, the hardest Abraham had ever been assigned. The life of faith does not promise easy choices and well-lit paths. It is for those who trust in God implicitly. Abraham, Samuel, the 3 Hebrew boys, Daniel, and the other heroes of faith mentioned in Hebrews 11 are prime role models for us to follow, since they had this kind of trust. The silent 3 days of trudging uphill covering 45 miles must have seemed long. It gave Abraham an opportunity to recall how God had previously directed his life. He had not failed him then, nor was he failing him now. Obedience had brought the group to the right place, in sight of Mount Moriah. The rest of the journey became even lonelier. Only Abraham and Isaac went to the actual spot of sacrifice. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham's obedience to God was reaffirmed, and his faith in God was expressed in these eloquent words. No one who was only partially committed and only half-hearted in believing God's promises could truly say, "We will worship, and then we will come back to you." His commitment to obedience was unwavering. He was determined to complete what God had commanded. We must detect God's voice. We must do what he tells us to do, and we must believe his promises. In part 3, it says that Abraham knew how to believe the promises of God. The text is from Genesis 22, verses 6 through 18, which says, "Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. He himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, 'Father.' 'Yes, my son,' Abraham replied. 'The fire and the wood are here,' Isaac said, 'but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham answered, 'God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.' And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He mounted his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy,' he said. 'Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." The wood for the sacrifice was taken from the donkey and placed on the strong back of the teenage son. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. The silence relating to the sacrifice was broken. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. The details of how that lamb would be provided did not play out exactly the way Abraham thought they would. He expected to slay his son, and he believed God would raise him from the dead. God had in mind the ram and the way it was supplied when he tested Abraham. God was concerned with Abraham's willingness. The voices of Isaac and Abraham have echoed and re-echoed through the annals of history. The submission of Isaac and the expression of the confidence of Abraham are equal to any found in history. No wonder that they are considered heroes of our faith. Both father and son deserve recognition for this courageous act of faith and obedience. Abraham built an altar when they reached the place God told him about. He had built many altars, but this was the most important one he had ever built. He arranged the wood on top of the altar. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. There was neither resistance nor struggle on the part of Isaac. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Again the silence was broken, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. God called Abraham's name twice, as he did with Moses at the burning bush and Saul on the Damascus road. He may have done this to make sure they understood the urgency of what God had to say to them. This divine interruption occurred because his listening ears, yielded will, and strong faith were in full harmony with God's will. When the knife blade of obedience reached its height, the lamb was provided. God responded. Man's extremity is always God's opportunity. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." We do not know Abraham's thoughts, but we know he demonstrated his obedience and faith by his actions. Soon the world will know of Abraham's reverential fear and complete trust in God. What are our lives saying about our faith and obedience to God? Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. It was not happenstance that the ram was found. Divine providence placed it in the right place at the right time to accomplish God's purpose. The future of Abraham and Isaac was in God's hands all the time. The greatness of their need never exhausted God's supply. There is no safer place in all the earth than in his hands. God had provided the burnt offering. It became the substitute in the place of Isaac. This sacred spot became Abraham's and Isaac's special Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. It was their God moment of memory for the rest of their lives. They could never forget that when Abraham raised the knife blade to its highest to slay Isaac, a lamb was found. And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." It became a symbolic and a messianic prophecy. It was near this spot that Solomon built the altar in the temple of the Lord, upon which many lambs were burned as sacrifices to the Lord. It was close to the area where Abraham's greater son, Jesus Christ, gave his life as an atoning sacrifice for a sinful world. The angel of the Lord had another message for Abraham. "I swear by myself that because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Abraham left Beersheba doing the will of God. On Mount Moriah he was suffering the will of God. He returned to Beersheba rejoicing in the will of God. He abode in Beersheba, living in the will of God. What a wonderful way to celebrate passing the greatest test of his life. Why not join him? In today's life application, it says that we have examined the successful testing of one of the greatest human beings of all time. Some of the lessons we have learned include the following. All Christians will be tested. Our wills must be fully surrendered to God. Our needs will never exhaust God's supply. Obedience that leads to taking the knife to slay will find a lamb to supply. God did not promise us an easy way to heaven, but he did promise a way to heaven. God has planned our future. Trust him. He knows what is best. Abraham legally owned only a burial plot in Hebron that he purchased from Ephron. However, all of Palestine was his land by God's promise. He lived in tents like a stranger in a foreign land. His future was supplied by a sovereign God, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. He found that city. So can we.